what is central to the movement is a kind of overarching critique based on a claim about how the whole political economy of capitalism works at this time. So with regard to the Bloombergville activists, the point at which they saw city agencies and unions backing off their overarching demand to make the big banks and millionaires pay, and instead cutting deals to satisfy their own constituencies' narrow interests, was the point at which they began to make direct contact with indignados from Spain and Greece who were in New York City. And there were a lot of people who went back and forth over the summer, continued to meet in New York in the general assemblies that had become the kind of the nucleus of organizing of the movement, and that ultimately led to Occupy Wall Street in the fall.
Sarah, I think we've got a problem because you're not very far into your paper yet, and it's half an hour's already gone. Can you summarize somehow?
I will summarize. So what I'm trying to do ultimately in this paper is ask whether there are potential linkages and common ground, and I will quickly go through 3 initiatives that have traction in the movement. These are the NEED Act, which is by U.S. Congressperson Dennis Kucinich, the National Emergency and Employment Defense Act, the National Nurses Campaign for a Financial Transaction Tax, and a Commons Coalition of Occupy Wall Street. The NEED Act basically emerged in 2009-2010 to address the sluggish recovery and public anger at the lack of accountability that is the public perception about the Federal Reserve's actions. The political objective of the act was to democratize the Federal Reserve by making it accountable to Congress. This was supposed to have 3 primary outcomes: to place the Federal Reserve inside the Treasury and to make it into a monetary authority, to restrict its emergency powers as a lender of last resort and make those accountable to a 2/3 vote of Congress and approval of an emergency board, including the president, the leaders of both parties, and the heads of all the major committees in Congress. It was also intended to, depending on how you read it, either abolish fractional banking or require 100% reserves. So this is a very eclectic and set of supporters, from unions which have endorsed it to the Libertarian U.S. presidential candidate, Ron Paul. But what's important to understand about this initiative is it's not a piece of legislation designed to be enacted into law, but instead to provoke public debate about the democracy and accountability of the Federal Reserve Bank. And this is the source of its populist appeal. Certainly the state of the U.S. political system, with its inability to reach decisions, gives one pause as to whether it would be wise to put such decisions in the hands of a Congress which can't take decisions. But the public debate that this has provoked, and there's really a lot of traction for this within the Occupy movement, it points to a great educational need and a thirst to understand, how we can restrict these institutions that seem to be out of control. So this is the kind of discussion that could be engaged with as part of an effort to find common ground. Interest in the Act relates to questions about how key institutions operate in national and global economies. A list of questions that I think come up from the Occupy movement are, what should be the core business of a banking system that operates for people's real needs? What's required politically to shrink the banking sector and make the economy less risk-driven? How should banks be governed and made transparent and accountable? What's the role of civil society, trade unions, and social movements in a banking system whose mission is social inclusion? How can banks be better socialized or embedded in society? These are all questions that have come up from the Alternative Banking Group and others, other working groups within the occupation. National Nurses United has a Tax Wall Street to Heal America campaign. The relationship between trade unions and the Occupy movement has been very complicated, because not only are a number of people who are involved in the movement in trade unions, but trade unions have come out at points when the occupations were in danger of being cleared and brought out many members. So their ability to protect these nascent forms of organization were seen as instrumental. but nevertheless, there's a distrust. There was an incident where trade unions participated in a large demonstration in support of the occupation, but the union leaders arranged with the police to be arrested and then released immediately, and so this was seen as, again, a kind of being complicit with the authorities in a way that complicated the balance of trust and fear of co-optation that's been characteristic of the relationship between the Occupy movement and organized labor. The National Nurses Union seems to be doing it differently. There's a link to Bloombergville because the nurses staged a large demonstration and brought nurses from all over the world to New York and the steps of Federal Hall in June. They converged unexpectedly with the Bloombergville occupation and invited speakers from Bloombergville to put on nurses' uniforms and to speak at their rally. And I think their identification of the callous and risky behavior of finance with an illness that's affecting the country and the world, which the nurses say makes it impossible for them to serve their patients, makes it impossible for them to do their work, gives them a kind of credibility that some of the other unions have not enjoyed. They're adhering to an overarching message, which is the point that Judith Butler was making, that emphasizes the illness of inequality and the need for a radically transformative strategy. They've steered a politically difficult path because they have kept close to the Occupy movement while at the same time working with more traditional advocacy organizations campaigning for a Robin Hood tax in Europe and going to protests at the G20 and G8. And I think, I'm going to quote briefly the political director of NNU on the nurses' vision for transformation. He said, "We demand systemic and not just incremental change. We demand social justice for all, not just for a single group. We don't don't cut funds for this or that. We demand health care for all."
Could you sum up in one sentence, in 1 minute? So we can have time for at least a little discussion and then the other papers.
Well, unfortunately, I'll skip the part about multilateralism and the commons. I think
your paper has attracted quite an attention, and quite a lot of people have already read it actually, so from that point of view.
Okay, well, this is something very new for me. I mean, as I said, I'm wearing two hats, and I'm trying to do something with this paper that I think I really welcome your feedback. But in conclusion, what I want to emphasize is that standard explanations are not satisfying this movement, just as the movement is not satisfying the request to produce demands, because it's searching for something else. It's in a period of strategizing about where it's going, about figuring out how to self-organize without the influence of other bodies. And one of the primary things I would say is really required for the movement is something that's not a standard explanation for how to fix the financial system. So explanations that talk about the explosion of financialization is simply a result of something gone a little bit wrong, finance not operating the way it is supposed to by providing funds to the real economy, which could then be reinvested, simply doesn't seem to fit the facts about how non-financial corporations were investing their own money. And so I guess in conclusion, I invite your questions, and what I'd like to say is that many have, certainly in the US, have wanted to attach themselves to this movement, especially when it was making the news all the time. Even Obama is bringing up the message of the 99% against the 1%. But I think finding real partnership in the movement, it requires showing a greater transparency of leadership and the ability on the part of traditional organizations to engage in, I guess, what we might call the public use of reason.